It was the morning of the 20th of July 1944. Adolf Hitler entered the Wolf's Lair headquarters. There he met with generals for a strategy briefing. Colonel Claus Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg was also present, and in his bag he was carrying an explosive device. At 12:42 p.m. the bomb exploded, killing several people. But Hitler, the target of the attack, was only slightly injured. The coup had failed. The failed putsch against Hitler has gone down in history. In Germany, the 20th of July is an important anniversary. For German Chancellor Angela Merkel, the conspirators remain important role models for the present day. Von Stauffenberg was executed that very night. In the wake of the failed coup, the Nazis killed some 200 co-conspirators. But their memory lives on today.
Exzellenzen,
Your Excellencies, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen representing all level of the state, in particular, a very warm welcome to you, Ms. von Hammerstein. I welcome you on behalf of all the family members and relations of the wives and men of the resistance. Ladies and gentlemen, in this very courtyard 75 years ago, Friedrich Albrecht, Claus Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, Albrecht Ritter Merz von Quirnheim and Werner von Haften were executed. Their co-conspirator Ludwig Depp died earlier in the Bendlerblock. The assassination attempt against Hitler had failed, as had the attempted coup. This failure was a disaster for our country, for Europe, and the world. Many millions of people actually lost their lives until the end of the war, 1945, in that brief period. They became victims of both the war and the Shoah. National Socialists defamed Count von Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators as criminal traitors and a small clique of ambitious people. The family members lost husbands, partners, fathers, sons, brothers. They themselves had to suffer humiliation and violence. Many were arrested, some were interred in concentration camps. Several children, following the 20th of July 1944, were taken from their parents and taken to Bad Sachsa, in a home for children, the youngest of them only a few weeks old, the oldest 15. In this home, the children were given new names, and the photographs of their parents were taken away, so that all memory of their origin could be extinguished. But this failed. One of these children, Christa von Hofacker, then 12 years old, in 1946 wrote in her notes, and I quote, "Whether we'll never be allowed to say our names? Will we always have to be ashamed of our origin? No, I could never do that. One has to be proud of a father and of all the others." End of quote. 75 years after the failed coup, we commemorate the men and women of the 20th of July 1944 with the greatest of respect. They acted when others were silent. They followed their conscience. They took responsibility for their and our country when others looked away. They faced up to an inhumane system. They were very aware what consequences their action might have for themselves and their families. They were willing to make the greatest of sacrifices, their lives. They put a sense of humanity above their own lives. Looking at the resistance fighters of the 20th of July is something which has changed over decades, thankfully, one should say, because even the end of the war didn't give their families the recognition they deserved. Far too frequently they were still denigrated. Their image was put in the wrong way, they were put in the wrong way, they were exaggerated, they were underestimated, their image was distorted, there was not enough knowledge about them. Today we have a memorial, and the memorial place for the German resistance fighters just opposite the Defense Ministry headquarters in Berlin. Setting up this memorial place was actually due to a recommendation made by family members. This is where they found a place to live their personal mourning. But the place is more. It is also a venue for public and general remembrance. Remembering the men and women of the resistance is part of the German raison d'etre of the country, which is also borne out by the fact that the swearing of allegiance, the oath-taking ceremony of new recruits to the German armed forces happened here today. Count von Stauffenberg became a symbol of resistance, but his is not the only resistance narrative, nor was the 20th of July the only act of resistance. From the very beginning, there were brave people who stood up against the National Socialist regime, and even though there weren't enough of them, resistance was multifaceted. And today we commemorate all of them, all who stood up against this inhumane dictatorship. We remember the White Rose Kreisau Circle and the Red Kapelle. We think of the resistance groups like Onkel Emil in Berlin, a group of intellectuals who spent the war years to try to support Jews and forced laborers from other countries. We're thinking of Helmut Tübiger's group, who provided leaflets to the laborers in Hamburg. We're thinking of other honorable people like Karl Friedrich Goerdeler or Julius Leber. We commemorate the communist resistance fighters. We remember the Protestant Church, the Catholic Church resistance fighters, priests like Bernhard Lichtenberg or Cardinal von Galen. We also commemorate the resistance of the Jehovah's Witnesses and of the Sinti and Roma. And last but very much not least, we remember the Jewish resistance, the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. We're thinking of those who rose up in the extermination camps of Sobibor and Treblinka. I would also like to commemorate those brave people who hid Jews in their homes or helped them to survive in other ways. Many, some of whose names we do not know, the silent hearers, as they're called, showed in manifold different ways that they opposed the National Socialist rule of terror. In a very few days, on the 1st of August, the Poles will commemorate the Warsaw Uprising in the ghetto 75 years ago, which was the largest uprising against the National Socialist occupation. The bloody way in which that was put down caused many, many victims, especially civilians, and I remember them in a sense of humility. Today we commemorate resistance against the tyranny of National Socialism, irrespective of individual, personal, ideological or religious convictions. But how can an individual react to such a system which is almost overwhelming, though inhumane? How can we stand against it? How can you light the light of humanity in this deep darkness and provide a light for others? The one thing that unified all those who stood up against them was their conscience. The convictions, the ideas they followed made it imperative for them to act. They were certain that they could not justify not acting. They couldn't justify that to themselves or to others. Holz put that in a very concise way. He said, I have to be in it. When we talk about our European history, when we rely on European values, that is one of the examples we have in front of our internal eye. These brave people risking their lives, risking death in the sense of freedom and liberty, and who paid the sacrifice. What does their example mean for us today? Today is a time which is so different. What do they have to tell us now? The men and women of resistance follow their conscience. They stand for all those who fight for humanity, for right, for freedom. To honor their memory is something which is far more than tell people about something which happened in history. They allowed us to draw lessons from the past and helped us to shape the basis of our work and lives. Their action actually proved an inspiration to the founding fathers and mothers of the German Basic Code, the Constitution, which was then passed on the 23rd of May 1949, just a few years later. Article 1 of that Basic Code says, the indignity of man is inviolable. To respect and protect it is an obligation of all state. Bauer. And they also, in Article 4, talk that the freedom of conscience, of faith, and of religious and ideals are inviolable. So this basic law became the foundation of the way in which we lived in this free democracy based on the rule of law. The institutions of our country both embody and protect the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution. And this means that today's situation is fundamentally different from the rule of terror under National Socialism. And yet, even the institutions of our state, based on the rule of law, live by and of what the citizens do, how we act. For our citizens today, the men and women of the resistance are role models, however different our circumstances may be now. If we defend humanity or democracy, do we do that, or do we take these things as a given and think somebody else will take care of it? Do we show moral courage when we witness racism, anti-Semitism, indignity, hatred, or do we just look aside because it might be uncomfortable for us? Citizens living in a democracy have an obligation. Part of this obligation is that politicians, volunteers, anybody who has public responsibility should not be afraid for their lives and limbs in what they're doing. And one of our obligations is that Jews in Germany can wear the kippah wherever they like. And it also means that we do not allow people inciting violence against others just because they look different, talk differently, or have a different opinion. It is part of our obligation that we use the law enforcement opportunities that the rule of law gives us, and we do so consistently when people are threatened or even killed. And it is also our responsibility that we do not let knowledge of our history fade away. This knowledge, the lessons from this knowledge, is something which each and every generation has to work to achieve and learn. That is why in schools, in museums, in various places of commemoration, we have to make sure that this happens even in the future. The 20th of July, Henning von Tresckow, Graf von Stauffenberg, the White Rose, Julius Leber, the Warsaw Uprising, all these are names and events that future generations should always know. Let us live up to this obligation on the small and large scale. Let us commemorate all the resistance fighters and commemorate them also by ourselves being strongly in favor of a peaceful way of living together. Let us honor them by showing moral courage and by defending values that are common to us all, instead of looking away and being silent. Let us be committed instead of just looking to our own advantage. Let us be strong. Let us defend and be engaged in our democracy based on the rule of law. And that is also true when we have to defend the international system of order, which was brought about as a lesson from the Second World War and the dreadful National Socialism. Europe was able to overcome centuries of conflict. A system of peace emerged, which is based on what we have in common, instead of what seem to be national strengths. We Europeans happily are united. But even today, we need to defend the future of the European Union resolutely against nationalists and populists. We need to do so more than ever, and this actually applies to beyond Europe. We need to act multilaterally, not unilaterally, globally, not nationally.
Global statt national.
Globally, not nationally, open-minded, not isolationist, jointly, not alone. These are the jobs of our time. Whether we're talking about peace, about combating climate change and the problem of species dying, the problems of starvation and what else is happening. And then we have to follow the lodestar described by Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he talked about his responsibility. He said, maybe the last day of the world will start tomorrow. Then we will happily put aside our work for a better future, but not a day before. Ladies and gentlemen, if those people who dare to resist have helped to create and believed in a better future for Germany, for Europe, that's what they worked for, That's what they risk all for. This responsibility, this strength of character, is evinced in the big deeds as well as in the small deeds. Of course, you will not always succeed. There will be failures, but inaction will not win the future. And that is true for us today as well. There are many different motivations that cause people to contribute to the common good. In whichever way anybody helps to make our country more worth living in, it's always the best way of remembering with honor the men and women of the resistance. Thank you.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel. And now follows another musical interlude, and after that there will be a commemorative address, a remembrance of the dead from Axel Schment, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the 20th of July 1944 Foundation. Wir gedenken unserer Toten.
We remember our dead.
Heute, vor 75 Jahren,
75 years ago today, 5 German officers died at the Bendlerblock building for attempting, along with others, to free Germany of Hitler and his National Socialist reign of terror. They were the first to die on the night of July 20th, 1944. Ludwig Beck, Friedrich Albrecht, Claus Schenk, Count von Stauffenberg, Albrecht Ritter-Merz von Queenheim, Werner von Haften. We honor their names engraved on a plaque here in the ceremonial courtyard at Stauffenbergstrasse. Their names stand for all those who took part in the attempt to overthrow the Nazi regime on July 20th, 1944. At this ceremony, we also remember all those who opposed the regime from 1933 on and who suffered, often alone, discouraged, given the widespread support for National Socialism among the German people and even well beyond Germany's borders. They resisted the regime both openly and in secret. They came from all political parties of the Weimar Republic. There were members of trade and labour unions. There were business owners and workers, civil servants, professors, students, soldiers from all parts of the military and of all ranks, and there were men and women of the churches. Their resistance was mostly based on strong convictions and a sense of ethical responsibility. Following their incarceration and the humiliation before the so-called People's Court or the Nazi special courts, many of them were executed, or some even chose to take their own lives in order not to betray their friends while being tortured. Many were killed in the concentration camps of the Nazis. We do not forget those who had the courage to oppose Hitler's senseless and destructive warmongering and to have to pay for their opposition with their lives. We remember those who distributed leaflets or who tried in other ways to open people's eyes to the crimes of the Nazi regime. They too were condemned to death. We remember those who, out of compassion and respect for human dignity, provided shelter and aid to Jews, other victims of persecution, foreign prisoners of war, and who were killed for that. We remember those who dared to plan a new order for Germany after the war, or who sought allies abroad and were killed for that reason. All of these people resisted the ideology and tyranny of the National Socialist regime. And so today, on this 20th of July 2019, standing for all those who had the courage to resist, I read out the following names: Jens Peter Jessen, Alfred Delp, Helmut James, Count Moltke, Max Habermann, Hans von Donani, Georg Elser, Fritz Dietloff, Count von der Schulenburg, Georg Alexander Hansen, Herbert Baum, Berthold Schenk, Count Stauffenberg, Cäsar von Hofacker, Heinrich Count of Lindau-Steinort, Willy Graf. We also remember the millions of Jews murdered in the death camps and all the other victims of the Nazi terror, racist ideology, despotic rule, and inhumane warfare. Today, we remember 12 years of terrible suffering and death on an unprecedented scale. Yet, even today, irresponsible leaders threaten our world with war, violence, and terror against people and nations. So our dead remind us, the living, to oppose violence and injustice without hesitating. It is therefore very important for us to stand up for the freedom of conscience and for the rights of those who think differently and to treat them with respect. They remind us to uphold the dignity of our fellow humans. They remind us Germans, and us Europeans and the rest of the world. We remember our dead with gratitude and in silence.
What we're now seeing is the beginning of a wreath-laying ceremony that will last several minutes, involving prominent representatives of state and government. hearing.
Your mic's not up.
And with that wreath-laying ceremony, the ceremony at today's Bendlerblock, the Defence Ministry in the centre of Berlin, draws slowly to a close. A very moving ceremony indeed, in the sunshine in the heart of the German capital.